You were told a story. It started before you were born, before you could question it. The story went like this: study hard, go to college, get a degree, find a job, work your way up, buy a house, start a family, build a life. The sequence was presented as inevitable, not easy, but reliable, a formula. If you did A and B, you would get C and D. The American dream wasn't sold as luxury. It was sold as accessible reward for consistent effort. Your parents believed it. Your teachers repeated it. The entire infrastructure of childhood was designed to prepare you for a future where this sequence would unfold naturally, predictably, the way it had for the generation before. Then you grew up and the math stopped working. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just slowly, quietly, in ways that were hard to articulate at first. You did what you were told. You studied. You went to school. You took the loans because everyone said education was the investment that always paid off. You graduated. You sent out resumes, dozens, hundreds. You got interviews. You performed well. You were told you were impressive, talented, exactly what they were looking for. Then you were offered the job, and the salary didn't match the rent in the city where the job was located. You did the calculation. After taxes, after student loan payments, after rent, after utilities, after transportation, after food, you'd have maybe $300 left each month, if nothing went wrong, if you never got sick, if your car didn't break down, if you never wanted to do anything except work and survive. You thought maybe you made a mistake, chose the wrong field, went to the wrong school. So you looked at your friends. Different majors, different industries, same result. Engineers making $50,000 a year in cities where a one-bedroom apartment costs $2,000 a month. Teachers making $38,000. Nurses making $52,000. Marketing coordinators making $42,000. The jobs existed, the careers were real. But the numbers at the end, they didn't allow for the life you were promised. They allowed for survival. Roommates in your 30s. Delayed everything, no house, no family, no stability. Just work that paid enough to keep working. You started seeing the pattern everywhere. The timeline your parents followed: school, job, house by late 20s, family by early 30s, stability by 40. It wasn't just delayed for your generation. It was broken. The math made it impossible. Housing prices had tripled in 20 years while wages increased by maybe 15%. Your parents bought their first house for $180,000 in 1997. That same house is now worth $540,000. They bought it on a single income, $60,000 a year. The mortgage was $1,800 a month. Manageable. You make $60,000 a year in today's economy, you're doing well. But that house now requires a down payment of $108,000 and a monthly mortgage of $3,600 on $60,000 a year. You can't save for the down payment because your rent is already consuming 40% of your income. And if you somehow did save for 10 years, housing prices would increase another 30% while you were saving. The system wasn't just harder, it was mathematically unwinnable for most people. And everyone kept saying, be patient, work hard, it'll happen. But the numbers said it wouldn't. You weren't lazy. You weren't entitled. You were doing exactly what you were told. And the result was a life that looked nothing like the promise. You'd work until 65, rent forever, never own, never build equity, never have the security your parents achieved by 35. And that was if everything went right. If you never got sick, never had an emergency, never made a single financial mistake. Education became the first visible fracture. You were told, go to college, get a degree, the investment will pay off. So you did. You borrowed $40,000. $60,000, $80,000, because everyone said it was worth it. That a degree was the entry ticket to the middle class. Then you graduated and discovered the entry ticket didn't guarantee entry. It guaranteed debt. You had a degree and a job that required a degree but paid like it didn't. Meanwhile, the debt grew, interest compounding while you made minimum payments that barely touched the principal. You'd be paying for 20 years, maybe 30, paying for an education that was supposed to launch you into prosperity but instead anchored you to a financial obligation that prevented the very stability it promised to create. Some of your friends didn't go to college, went to trade schools, became electricians, plumbers, welders. They're doing better, not rich but stable, no debt, decent income, able to save. You start wondering if the people who told you college was essential were wrong, or lying, or just repeating advice that worked in 1985 but stopped working in 2010. Either way, you're holding the debt, and the anger is quiet, not explosive. Just a slow, simmering realization that you were sold something that didn't exist. The jobs changed too, not just the pay, the structure. Your parents had jobs with pensions, health insurance, paid time off, security. You have gig work, contract positions, freelance opportunities. The language is designed to make instability sound like freedom. You're not unemployed. You're an independent contractor. You're not struggling. You're hustling. You're not being exploited. You're building your personal brand. The semantics shifted to disguise the fact that the safety net disappeared. You work, but there's no guarantee of tomorrow, no benefits, no retirement, no sick days. Just a constant churn of applications, interviews, short-term gigs, and the perpetual anxiety of not knowing if you'll have income 3 months from now. So you stopped planning, not consciously at first, but you notice it over time. You don't think about buying a house anymore. It's not a goal, it's a fantasy. like owning a yacht, technically possible, but so far outside the realm of your reality that thinking about it feels dishonest. You don't plan for kids, not because you don't want them, because the math says you can't afford them. Childcare costs more than rent. Healthcare is tied to employment. You don't have consistently. Schools require stable addresses in good districts which require houses you can't buy. The pathway that was supposed to be natural, grow up, get stable, have a family, became a luxury accessible only to people who started with wealth or got exceptionally lucky. Your relationship with time changed. Your parents thought in decades. They made 5-year plans, 10-year plans, bought furniture that would last 20 years because they knew they'd still be in the same house. You'd think in months, maybe a year. You buy cheap furniture because you'll probably move. You don't commit to anything long-term because long-term stopped feeling real. The future became this abstract thing that other people had. People with trust funds, people whose parents could co-sign mortgages, people who didn't start adulthood with negative net worth. Disengagement became logical, not rebellion. Adaptation, you were told, work hard, climb the ladder, earn your place. But the ladder was broken. You could work hard, you did, and still not move up because there were fewer rungs, more people competing for them. And the people at the top weren't retiring. They couldn't afford to. So the ladder became a waiting room. And waiting felt like dying slowly. You started hearing people your age say things your parents would never understand. I'm not trying to win the game. I'm trying to stop playing, not because they were lazy, because they calculated the cost, the time, the energy, the sacrifice required to maybe, possibly, if everything went right, achieve a fraction of what their parents had. And the math said, not worth it. Some people left, not loudly, just quietly updated their LinkedIn to remote and moved to Portugal, Mexico, Thailand, places where the cost of living was low enough that their American income, even gig income, allowed them to live comfortably. They didn't leave because they hated America. They left because the American dream priced them out. They could live better, cheaper, with less stress somewhere else. And the narrative that called that unpatriotic or cowardly didn't land anymore. Because patriotism required a country that wanted you to succeed, and the math suggested it didn't. Others opted out differently. Stopped pursuing careers, stopped trying to impress, started living in vans, tiny homes, communal spaces, minimized expenses to the point where they didn't need much income, worked part-time, spent the rest of their time doing things they actually cared about. The older generation called it failure, lack of ambition. But it wasn't. It was a rational response to a system that demanded everything and offered nothing. Why sacrifice your 20s and 30s working 80 hours a week for a company that would lay you off during the next downturn, just for the chance to maybe afford a house at 50? Why not just live small, work less and have time now instead of betting on a future that probably won't come? The psychological toll was harder to measure but impossible to ignore. Anxiety rates in people under 30 were higher than any previous generation. Not because life was harder physically, because it was harder psychologically. The uncertainty, the lack of trajectory, the feeling that you were doing everything right and still falling behind. Your parents had a script, you didn't. You were improvising in an economy that punished improvisation. And the mental health crisis that followed wasn't weakness. It was the predictable result of asking an entire generation to function in a system that stopped functioning for them. You started noticing how people talked. Your friends didn't say, when I buy a house anymore. They said if. They didn't say, when I have kids. They said, I don't think I will. Not with sadness, with resignation. The dreams didn't die loudly. They faded, quietly, replaced by smaller, more achievable goals. Not home ownership, just a one-bedroom apartment without roommates. Not career advancement, just a job that didn't make you miserable. Not building a legacy, just surviving without debt. The ambitions shrank to fit the possible, and the possible kept shrinking. The political conversations felt irrelevant. Both sides talked about the economy like it was something that could be fixed with the right policy. But the problem wasn't policy, it was math. You couldn't policy your way into affordable housing when investment firms were buying neighborhoods as assets. You couldn't vote your way into higher wages when corporations were optimizing for shareholder value, not worker stability. The system was working as designed. It just wasn't designed for you. It was designed for people with capital. And if you didn't have capital, you weren't broken. You were simply outside the demographic the system served. You saw the older generation's advice for what it was. Outdated. They told you to work your way up. But corporate ladders had been replaced by contract work. They told you to buy a house. But down payments required savings you couldn't accumulate while paying rent and debt. They told you to invest in retirement. But retirement accounts required disposable income you didn't have. Every piece of advice assumed a world that no longer existed. And when you tried to explain that, they didn't believe you. They thought you weren't trying hard enough, weren't being resourceful enough, weren't tough enough. Because they succeeded in a world with different math, and they couldn't see that the equation had changed. The advertising industry kept selling the dream. Commercials showing young couples buying homes, starting families, living the life. But everyone your age knew it was fiction. Casting actors playing roles no one could afford. The gap between the advertised life and the actual life became so wide it was almost funny. Almost you'd see an ad for a bank. Start your future today and you'd think, with what money? The future they were selling required a present you didn't have. Some people got angry, organized, protested, demanded change, but most just got tired. Anger requires energy, and energy requires hope. When you stop believing things can improve, anger turns into something else. Numbness, detachment, a quiet decision to stop caring about things you can't control. You still showed up to work, paid your bills, functioned, but the part of you that believed in the promise that died, not violently, just slowly. One rejected application at a time, one rent increase at a time, one conversation with your parents where they didn't understand why you couldn't just do what they did. The cultural shift was almost invisible unless you were living it. Fewer people getting married, fewer people having kids, fewer people buying homes, fewer people investing in long-term anything. The statistics showed it, but the statistics didn't capture the why, they just showed the what. And policymakers scratched their heads wondering why Gen Z wasn't following the traditional life script, as if it were a choice, as if people were opting out of stability because they preferred instability. They weren't. They were adapting to an economy that made stability inaccessible, and calling that adaptation failure was just another way to avoid admitting the system broke. You found yourself thinking about leaving more often. Not dramatically, just practically. What if you moved somewhere cheaper? Somewhere the salary-to-rent ratio made sense. Somewhere a job didn't require a degree that cost $80,000. Somewhere effort correlated with progress. It wasn't fantasy. People were doing it. Friends, acquaintances, people you followed online. They left and their lives got better. Not perfect, but manageable. And manageable started to sound like winning. The American dream didn't die in a single moment. It eroded, piece by piece, promise by promise, until what remained was a phrase, a marketing slogan, something politicians invoked and corporations advertised, but that fewer and fewer people believed in because belief requires evidence. And the evidence said, if you weren't born into wealth, your odds of achieving the stability your parents had were slim, not impossible. Slim, and slim wasn't good enough to build a life on. Slim was a lottery ticket, and you couldn't plan a future around lottery tickets. So you stopped planning, stopped dreaming in the way you were taught to dream, started finding meaning in smaller things, moments instead of milestones, experiences instead of possessions, connections instead of careers. Not because those things were better, but because they were achievable. And achieving something anything felt necessary when everything else felt out of reach. The video ends here. No solution offered, no hope injected, just a question left hanging in silence. If you were born today, into this economy, with this math, with these odds, would you still believe in the future you were promised? Or would you do exactly what you're watching happen now? Adapt, opt out, leave, survive, and call it living because there's no other option left.